We live in an oligarchy. That's a system where corporations and billionaires own most of the politicians and call all the shots. But there's a glimmer of hope in the form of unions who have started rising up. As unions fight to win power back for the people, it's important to know which members of Congress are allies, which are enemies, and which deserve their support. We're going to talk about why it's time for unions to get involved in Democratic primary elections, so that we can finally clean house. We tend to divide Congress into Republicans and Democrats. All Republicans in Congress take billionaire money and oppose unions, so they're obviously not our allies. But what about the Democrats? Congressional Democrats can be divided up into two factions. The first is the corporate Democrats, a corrupt faction of the party who take money from billionaires and do their bidding. These include Schumer, Pelosi, and the vast majority of congressional Democrats. The second faction is the Justice Democrats, also known as J-Dems, or the Squad, who are completely funded by small dollar donations. As a result, they support policies like universal healthcare that benefit poor people. But there are only 9 J-Dems in all of Congress, 10 if you count Bernie in the Senate. For the Justice Democrats, primary elections are everything. FYI, primary elections are the first round of elections in an election year, before the general election in November, that decide which candidate gets to represent each party in a particular race. If a Justice Democrat fails to defeat a corporate Democrat in the primary, then the corporate Democrat advances to the general election and the Justice Democrat is completely out. So you'd think that unions would support the Justice Democrats in their primary elections so that they can defeat the corporate Democrats, right? Wrong. Unions have a long history of sitting out primary elections completely and endorsing corporate Democrats in the November general election. Union leadership seems to think that they will get something from this tactic, but that simply isn't true. In 1976, the United Auto Workers agreed to endorse Jimmy Carter, a corporate Democrat, in the presidential general election if he promised to support universal healthcare. Carter promised, and rank-and-file UAW members campaigned hard for him, and as a result, Carter won. But once Carter got into office, under the influence of business interests, Carter refused to support universal healthcare. That's just one example. There are many more, such as Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and Obama. All of them were endorsed by unions, but all of them opposed universal healthcare and supported outsourcing deals like NAFTA, which gutted unions. Under the Obama administration, the corporate Democrat supermajority in the Senate also killed universal healthcare and pro-union legislation. So why do unions keep on endorsing these corporate goons? You can argue that this is just because in the past, there had never been any progressive Democrat running in a primary election. But that isn't true either. In 2020, Bernie Sanders ran against Joe Biden in the Democratic primary. Bernie's campaign was entirely funded by small dollar donations, while Biden's was almost entirely funded by large corporations. But most major unions either sat that primary election out, such as the AFL-CIO and SEIU, or endorsed Biden, such as NEA, UFCW, AFT, and AFSCME. This is despite the fact that Bernie explicitly ran on universal healthcare, which the AFL-CIO claims to support, while Biden explicitly ran against it. This is also despite the fact that universal healthcare is wildly popular among the American public, enjoying 75% support. The Biden saga doesn't end there. During his campaign, Biden promised to deny federal contracts to union busters, but when Amazon began a new round of union busting following a successful unionization drive at its Staten Island warehouse, Biden gave Amazon its contracts anyway. It was Bernie who begged Biden to do the right thing, to no avail. There are two morals to this story. One, unions lose when they fail to endorse progressive primary challengers instead of corporate Democrats. And two, that's because corporate Democrats are, by virtue of their funding, beholden to corporations. This begs the question, does it even matter if unions endorse J-Dems? Would it even make a difference if unions endorsed insurgent progressive challengers in Democratic primaries? We don't have data on this for national elections, but we do have data on this for local elections. A study by researchers from UPenn found that based on 299 local elections between 1990 and 2012, incumbents are between 22 to 41% less likely to win re-election if their challenger is endorsed by a union. That is a huge impact. The study also indicates that the insurgent challenger, once in office, pursued more pro-union policies than the ousted incumbent. So while no comprehensive study has been done on a national level, we can infer that unions endorsing Justice Democrats would make a big difference. So what would it look like if unions and Justice Democrats joined forces? Luckily for us, we have a real-world example, Summer Lee. When Summer Lee ran for the Pennsylvania State House of Delegates in 2020, she ran on small dollar donations and an economic populist agenda. She asked the state AFL-CIO for their endorsement, and they refused. But she won anyway. Later in 2022, Lee ran for Congress and managed to defeat her union-busting opponent by a tiny 0.4% margin despite his various union endorsements. Also, low-key, what union in their right mind would endorse a freaking union buster? Like, for real? Anyway, how did Summer Lee do this? The answer lies in the sauce. She was initially snubbed by old-school unions in Pitt, and then proceeded to found a group that successfully launched insurgent primaries to topple corporate Dems and repeatedly and relentlessly supported the organizing efforts of small local unions. For example, she supported a UPitt Medical Center union organizer when he had a panic attack. She also used her state delegate role to show up for and support a Starbucks that won its union drive. That is how she won her congressional race. She did the work of building extremely strong bonds of mutual solidarity with local labor that simply could not be broken. If the big unions had supported her too, she would have been unstoppable.
Huh?
Although she's already unstoppable, but you get what I mean. Later in 2024, the Pennsylvania State AFL-CIO gets new leadership, and they finally come around to endorsing Summer Lee. With this additional support, Lee easily crushed her corporate Democratic primary challenger by a 20% margin. As a cherry on top, once in office, Lee joined her fellow Justice Democrats in supporting Medicare for All and other progressive policies. This matters because it means that the idea of unions supporting Justice Democrats in Democratic primaries to take back power from the oligarchy is not an abstraction. It can work. It just requires strong mutual support from each side, for the politician to support the union's local efforts and for the union to support the politician's national run. As sweet as the story of Summer Lee is, it is important for both JDEMs and unions to avoid co-optation by corporate Dems once they have access to political power. This co-optation seems to happen when JDEMs and unions attempt to do insider negotiating with corporate Dems rather than doing public statements and protests alongside their constituents. In other words, inside game bad, outside game good. To understand this, let's consider the example of Medicare for All. During the 2020 presidential primary elections, AFT's leader, Randy Weingarten, attacked Medicare for All even though rank-and-file members supported it. In the same election cycle, leaders of various unions that claimed to support Medicare for All curtailed efforts to include it in the Democrats' platform, completely dissociating from their rank-and-file members. But as we discussed previously, this stance of trying to play the field and placate corporate Democrats, as opposed to militantly supporting the expressed needs of rank-and-file members, simply does not work. This is something that is well understood by local labor union members. At the same time that Weingarten and other national leaders were baselessly attacking Medicare for All, Massachusetts unions voted to vet presidential candidates using Medicare for All as a litmus test, breaking with leadership. That is called organizing, and it is good. That is what effective resistance looks like, when your leaders won't step up and want to work within the system. Raise hell and be vocal. The whole point of this video is that working behind the scenes with the corporate Dems is a zero-sum game. It is too bad that the national AFL-CIO didn't learn that lesson. However, incompetence on Medicare for All is not limited to national labor union leaders. Justice Democrats, while not corrupt, also have a history of trying to compromise with corporate Democrats, behind the scenes under some sort of delusion that this will get them something. It never does. For example, in 2020, when Pelosi needed the JDEM's votes to regain her position as Speaker of the House, AOC refused to force the vote on Medicare for All, despite many requests from her base. This was a failure to capitalize on her immense media presence. She wasted a perfectly good opportunity to expose the corporate Dems' position on an important issue, because she wanted to work with them. AOC made a similar blunder in 2024 when she defended Biden loyally long after most Democrats had realized that he was not cognitively able to be president. She also thanked Kamala and Biden for their leadership in a forceful endorsement of Kamala after Biden dropped out. In return for her loyalty, she seems to have believed that she would be picked to lead the House Oversight Committee, a position that she had expressed interest in. Instead, the corporate Democrats appointed corporate Democrat Jerry Connolly to the position. In other words, AOC's attempts to work behind the scenes or inside the system demonstrate that this is simply not a viable way for JDEMs or labor to get what they want. Rather, for both labor and JDEMs, the true path to power is embracing the view of rank-and-file supporters and publicly uplifting those demands, just like the Massachusetts unions and the force the vote proponents suggested. We love to hate on the JDEMs and the unions for being co-opted or incompetent when they fail to listen to rank-and-file constituents. But there are actually examples of them listening to their base crystal clear and using their national platforms to uplift those demands. Moments like these are instructive in showing when the collaboration between JDEMs and unions has the potential to be at its strongest, because holding true to the grassroots like this is the surest way to illustrate that, we can use the response of the JDEMs and unions to the genocide in Gaza as a case study. In November 2023, early into Israel's genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, local unions like the Oregon Educational Association, OEA, began organizing for a ceasefire extremely early and directly cited the actions of the JDEMs calling for that ceasefire. Then, in February 2024, UFCW of Washington State publicly endorsed the uncommitted movement protesting the Gaza genocide. This is important because it shows that the origins of labor's opposition to this genocide are local. This is truly what rank-and-file members think. To their massive credit, in April 2024, all the JDEMs held the line on this issue when not a single one of them voted in favor of sending weapons to Israel. They were and have been vocal on this issue, which has been very effective in drawing attention to it. The JDEMs then celebrated in May when Biden withheld weapons shipments to Israel. This measure was temporary, however, and Biden quickly returned to arming Israel in full. But imagine if there was a JDEM majority in Congress instead of just 10 of them, and they acted like this all the time. Even a corporate Democrat president wouldn't stand a chance. Meanwhile, labor's prong of the fight to end the genocide escalated as well. On July 7th, unions representing 6 million workers, nearly half of all union workers in the US, organized mass protests of rank-and-file members against the genocide. The escalation from calling for a ceasefire generally to calling for cutting off weapons is a very important one, and that is reflected by both JDEMs and labor. AOC's commitment to this effort lapsed briefly when she praised Kamala's stance on Gaza during her DNC speech on August 21st, but Ilhan Omar, DSA, and other leftist organizations responded swiftly and harshly to that act of disloyalty. This is exactly the level of discipline with regard to messaging and action that is needed to prevent movement candidates from diverging from the message. UAW and all of the JDEMs then collectively protested the DNC's refusal to include a Palestinian speaker at the convention the following day. Over the next several months, the rank-and-file protests by unions, correct votes by JDEMs, and strong public statements by both continued to put pressure on Kamala at the same time that Republican secretaries of state rejected the ballots of nearly 3.6 million Kamala voters. Kamala ultimately lost the election. Among voters not purged, a study by IMEU shows that Kamala lost because of her stance on Gaza. The organizing worked. It's just that without a JDEM alternative running against Kamala, the only result was that Kamala lost and that Trump won. That is objectively worse for the people of Gaza, though it is widely known that Kamala would have continued the genocide regardless, so it's important not to overstate this. In other words, this campaign showed that it doesn't matter if Kamala is the lesser of two evils. She is still evil, and it isn't worth it to give up the power to fight evil in exchange for a lesser evil. Nothing in the history we've discussed up to this point suggests that it is. The hope is that the level of organization that brought these poll numbers about can also be used to make it, so that weak corporate Democrats like Kamala are replaced by strong and principled progressives. If labor and the JDEMs work in tandem, that is certainly possible. They have to launch and actively support Justice Democrat primary campaigns because that's the only way to take Congress back, and they have to stop supporting corporate Democrats who make it to general elections because they always stab unions and JDEMs in the back. They also need to stop trying to play an inside game with corporate Democrats to avoid being co-opted, and need to focus on an outside game where they join rank-and-file union members and constituents at strikes and protests to put public pressure on Congress and the president. This connection with the public is their greatest strength because it keeps them accountable to their constituents and unites the collective power of unions and activists into a legislative force of nature. It can make or break a race like it did for Summerlee and Kamala. It can deny corporate Democrats the cover of being pro-union and the lesser of two evils by showing them for what they are: evil. It uplifts the issues that matter to poor people the most, and if evil doesn't like that, then it's time to clear.